if you can't raise corporate taxes, or if GOP takes control of the Senate, where do you get the money to do that? Do you still go forward with those plans and borrow?
Well, but we're going to have to raise corporate taxes.
But we're going to have to raise corporate taxes is a surreal line. The idea that Kamala Harris would say, we have to raise them, even though Stephanie Ruhle's question, regardless of how poorly Stephanie Ruhle handled the interview, is the accurate one. What if you can't get Republicans to do it? The answer from Kamala Harris is the answer of a child. We argue that this interview didn't move the needle, but what did it say about Kamala Harris as a whole, as a candidate, about where the Democratic Party is in realistically looking at November 5th. Tony Katz today. Great to be with you. Noah Rothman joins me right now from National Review. That's where you find his work, nationalreview.com. You can also find his book, The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. It's available at amazon.com, wherever fine books are sold. I do want to talk about the interview, but I'm going to get to it. First, we know that President Trump met with President Zelensky at Trump Tower, and both made the statement, or I should say Zelensky made the statement in front of Trump that Trump and I, quote, have the common view that the war in Ukraine has to be stopped. You have been writing over at National Review, Trump makes his hostility to Ukraine's cause clear. First things first, you think that Trump, if elected, has no interest in being supportive even after this meeting?
I don't know, and I tried to make the case in that piece that none of us really know, but his practiced ambiguity around this thing. He's been very ambiguous about what he actually wants to do in Ukraine, say that he wants to end the war on day one. Will do so, not just on day one anymore, it's before he's even elected president. Those of us who follow geopolitics seriously don't regard that as a serious proposition. We like to hear what his actual plans are, and insofar as he's been talking about them on the stump, recently aggrieved with some justification, as I conceded, that Zelensky's his staffers or himself allowing himself to be used as a political prop by Democrats in Pennsylvania had poisoned the well some with Republicans, and we've seen even supportive Republicans like Speaker Mike Johnson lash out at the Zelensky government. I thought that was reflected in his remarks on the stump, where Trump says things like Ukraine is gone, that we need even a bad deal, he says, would be better than the current state of affairs. That's just reflective of ignorance. Nobody who follows this war, or has followed this war since 2014 when it began, would suggest that there's anything like a deal that can be reached with the Kremlin based on the terms that it seeks, which is the dismemberment and subsumation of Ukraine into the Russian Federation, the elimination of its culture, the illegality of its language, the theft of its children in re-education camps, and the mass murder of its people. That's not a good deal. There is no alternative to that deal that any Ukrainian would support. And those of us who believe that the U.S.-led order in Europe should endure and fear the prospect of its dissolution by the sheer anxiety of its members on the frontier, who are now confronted with a Russia that's on their borders, aggressive and land hungry, that it would destabilize that covenant. I don't think there's a better deal to be had there. So the president's meeting with Zelensky, deserved, and it sounds to me, and sounds to you, it seems like that there's more wiggle room in Donald Trump's approach here.
But there's always
willing to be convinced. But the people in his ear, I think it's undeniable that the people in his ear in the Republican Party's firmament are turning against this war, and he is nothing if not a servant of the MAGA movement. Well, now let's happens to want.
Let's go over a couple of things. Talking to Noah Rothman of National Review. What Trump says and what Trump does historically can very often be different things. So the idea that Trump could still be supportive of Ukraine in this fight against Russia if he is the 47th president, I believe possible, and I do not believe that the MAGA folk by and large will speak out too loudly about it, except for some people who have enough stature to stick to their brand. Number two, the idea that we would want Ukraine to be destroyed by Russia, I do believe is madness. But in this last trip, Zelensky turned me off I'm like one of the last holdouts of conservative radio hosts who think that Ukraine not being destroyed by Russia is a smart thing. And he shows up on the C-17 military transport, hanging out with Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania. He's signing bombs like it's a joke. This is a nutty thing to do. This was a ridiculous thing to do. Never mind who was in Trump's ear for the sake of this conversation. Who in the world was in Volodymyr Zelensky's ear to say this was a good idea? And is it possible that he realized halfway through that, wait a second, I've made a grave mistake?
All right. Well, first of all, I don't subscribe to the notion that signing bombs is ridiculous. I would sign my name to any bomb that's going to fall on a Russian position or a Hezbollah position. And when Nikki Haley got in trouble from the left for this because it was so untoward and gauche, give me a break. This is American history you're going to war with, not these politicians. Second, we should be able to differentiate and distinguish. And I don't begrudge Republicans who are frustrated by the Zelensky team's decision to surround themselves with Democrats, although there is a Democrat in the White House. Nevertheless, that was a bad move. I mean, it poisoned the well among certain Republicans, but that's an emotional response. We should be capable, adults should be capable of recognizing an emotional response. And an emotional response has no bearing on whether or not it is good for the United States strategically to see its historic adversary in Russia destabilized and disabled on the battlefield in its war of territorial conquest. No bearing on that. In fact, if we were to defer to emotion, then we would have to concede Zelensky his own emotional responses, because we're all human, right? We all have these human frailties, and we can't begrudge them. So when he lashes out at people like J.D. Vance, who are hopelessly callous when they discuss what's happening to the Ukrainian people in the hands of their Russian captors, yeah, maybe he can object a little bit to that too. Are we to hold him to a higher standard than we hold even ourselves and our elected representatives? And then we're performing exegesis, priestcraft, on the president's statements just to divine his intention. No, we should expect more from professional communicators who are the stewards of our political interests. We should expect them to be clear and concise about how they see the execution of American national strategy on the international scene. The fact that this is so ambiguous isn't a failing on our part. It's a failing on his.
First, talking to Noah Rothman of National Review, allow me to push back. Number one, Americans signing bombs meant for our enemies was absolutely no problem. The Ukrainian president signing our bombs meant for Russia could very well be seen as a level of, I'll call it hubris, that doesn't actually bring people to the cause but repels people away. He's still in a public relations battle with half of the United States, and showing up here doesn't help that battle. To deny that that battle is happening by the idea of we still have to be supportive, I think is a bit of madness. There's a way to approach. Netanyahu approaches in a far superior way, in every way, talking about the battle that he is fighting for the good of the West and for the good of humanity writ large, is a far better approach than the Zelensky approach. And certainly showing up on the C-17, certainly signing the bombs, goes about that being very different than Nikki Haley or anybody else we could mention. But I do hold that Trump could end up being supportive here. But this, if he's elected, this goes now to a Kamala Harris commentary, where Kamala Harris stated that we are never going to surrender, and the Ukraine doesn't have to give up anything. And it's what it sounded like is, if I'm elected, if Kamala Harris is elected, she's committing the U.S. to a long and protracted war with Russia, including, by all means necessary. You get the feeling that if somebody was actually a reporter, they would ask her about ground troops. Did you hear Kamala Harris's commentary, and did you think she was making a strong case or creating an issue?
I did not hear those remarks, so I can't parse them. I would imagine that insofar as they're aligned with the Biden administration approach, that they're heavy on rhetoric and rhetorical commitments and very light on material commitments, or at least making good on those material commitments. The Biden administration deserves very little credit for the conduct of its war in Ukraine. It has never matched its rhetoric with the all that it insists it's giving to this conflict, from tanks to long-range weapons to fixed-wing aircraft to cluster munitions to HIMARS, you name it. This administration is hemmed and hawed and reluctant and invented for themselves inviolable Russian red lines that once they're violated, they say, okay, well, I guess we didn't really have to observe that, and only then do they relent, months after it's too late for it to have the battlefield effect that Ukrainians wanted. Ukrainians have nevertheless done a spectacular job, albeit constrained by the reluctance of this administration to give them what they want in a timely fashion, at repelling the Russian advance and preventing the Russian advance from conquering the country, which, by the way, everybody, including myself, who studied Russian combat tactics, thought was a fait accompli in February of 2022. The Ukrainians have outperformed expectations. And as my colleague at Commentary says, Abe Greenwald, has written ably, the Russian military has compensated for its lack of battlefield acumen and the fact that its non-commissioned officers do not have the liberty to make decisions on the battlefield in a timely fashion with monstrosity, with terrorism. It bombs hospitals and children's centers because it wants to terrorize the population of Ukraine into submission, which it did in Chechnya, which it did in Syria. This is what it does. This is the Russian war-fighting way now to compensate for its lack of strategic and tactical acumen. And that is not a mark of strength. That is a mark of a country that is failing to meet its challenges and to achieve its strategic objectives. We should have a little bit more respect, I think, for the Ukrainian way of warfighting, and not necessarily assume that they can't get the job done because we haven't given them the tools to get the job done, but rather commit to the prospect of giving them the tools to get the job done. The other side of a Russian victory is all downside for American strategic interests, and the other side of a Ukrainian victory, or something that looks like it, is all upside for America's interests. I do not see the arguments here as they are being made by those who are hostile to Ukraine's self-defense.
Let us move now to the interview. Stephanie Ruhle, MSNBC, with Kamala Harris. I know you spoke about this with Martha McCallum on Fox, and we have engaged it here. To the extent that people watch MSNBC interviews, did Kamala Harris lay out a vision that moves a needle for anybody sitting on the fence in this election?
No, I doubt it. I think that was an atrocious interview. And I will allow, and I said this to Martha yesterday, I'll allow the fact that none of us are the audience for this anymore. If you're still on the fence, a persuadable voter, you're probably not getting your news from news sources. You're getting them from alternative sources. If you see any clips of this, and it was very low rated when it broadcast, but if you see any clips of this, it will be on alternative sources, and we can't know how it's being packaged or massaged by those sources. And those voters probably do not respond to particulars, bullet points, a 12-point economic plan. They'll respond to sentimentality and that sort of thing. That said, what she was saying was a lot of nonsense, and she reverted to this form that is incredibly off-putting, at least to me, where she just kind of launches out in this directionless pursuit of a thought worthy of expression, and then eventually figures out where she's going, but she has no direction in the interim. And then she sounds, in that interim, she sounds like this hippie Mendocino County new age self-help guru who just
who had Mendocino County on their bingo card. Mendocino County, good Lord.
It's really insulting. But and there's that clip that you played, or I think you played, with introducing this corporate tax rate thing, and the premise that Stephanie Ruhle sort of touched on there but didn't dwell on is right and smart, where she says, how do you raise these corporate tax rates without incentivizing businesses to offshore, which is exactly what would happen if we were to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, as Kamala Harris wants, which would be the highest corporate tax rate in the OECD, in the European and American worlds. It would obviously create incentives to relocate abroad, and that would reduce the revenues that they're supposed to generate. Look, we can talk about revenues in this country, and we don't have a revenue problem. We generate plenty of tax revenue, but we have a gigantic spending problem. America's $35 trillion national debt is going to continue to grow unabated, and next year, the interest payments alone on that debt will top $1 trillion annually. In the next decade, Social Security's trust fund and Medicare shortly thereafter will go broke. They will reach the point of insolvency. There will be cuts to benefits, and it will create financial calamities such that we can anticipate the stock market would collapse and credit would dry up, and we would experience something like a debt crisis, a sovereign debt crisis. That's a really scary prospect. Nobody's talking about it. The assumption is the voters are too stupid or childlike or fragile to even understand the concept, much less understand the challenges that we have to meet and meet them. So we have these, piddling panders to the smallest sliver of the electorate that might be just economically illiterate enough to buy them as a panacea. But all of it is insulting. And it's not just Kamala Harris that's guilty of it, but this in this particular interview was especially egregious because she paired this pandering display of motivated ignorance with her own really grating affect, this lacquered on smile and the forced laugh, and all of it just being so superficial and frivolous that I don't think it did her any real favors. If she's lucky, very few people will have seen it.
Yeah, she might be just lucky in that regard. Noah Rothman, nationalreview.com. The book, The Rise of the New Puritans. Grab that at Amazon.com, wherever fine books are sold. Noah, always a pleasure. More is coming up. I'm Tony Katz. This is Tony Katz Today.